The morning Cornelius Keating rode into the county clerk's office in Caldwell, Kansas, and filed a deed transferring half his land to a woman he had never once spoken to. The clerk nearly swallowed his pen whole. It was the spring of 1878, and the prairies of southern Kansas were still raw and unpredictable things, wide open under a sky so blue it made a person ache to look at it directly. Caldwell itself sat at the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a town that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to be civilized or not. Cowboys drifted through in seasonal waves, cattle lowing in dusty clouds along the main road, and the sound of boots on wooden boardwalks and the occasional bark of a pistol were as common as birdsong. It was not, by any measure, a gentle place, but it was Cornelius Keating's place, and had been for going on 6 years now. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples when the humidity rose, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of Kansas limestone itself. He had built his ranch with his own 2 hands, starting from a single soddy and 160 acres of government land claimed under the Homestead Act in 1872. By 1878, he had expanded that claim to nearly 400 acres through purchase and hard work, had a proper timber frame house, a good well, a solid barn, and a small herd of longhorns that numbered close to 200 head. He had no wife, no family nearby, and no particular talent for the social graces that might have remedied the first of those absences. He was, by every account in Caldwell, a good man, a fair man, a man who paid his debts and kept his fences and helped his neighbors when their hay needed hauling. But he was also a quiet man, almost painfully so, and the women of Caldwell had largely given up on trying to draw him into conversation at church socials or town dances. He would stand at the edge of things, hat in hand, politely present but somehow utterly unreachable, as if a sheet of glass separated him from the rest of the warm, noisy world. The situation that brought him to the county clerk's office that April morning had begun 3 weeks earlier, when a letter arrived at the Caldwell post office addressed to one Catherine Sawyer, general delivery. The postmaster, old Elias Prout, had mentioned it aloud at the general store because the return address was a law office in St. Louis, and because Catherine Sawyer was a name nobody in Caldwell recognized. The letter sat for a week before word reached Cornelius through his neighbor Hank Dooley, who had heard it from the barber, who had heard it from Elias himself. What the letter contained, Cornelius would not learn for some time. What he knew, because Hank Dooley knew, because Hank Dooley made it his personal business to know everything within a 20-mile radius, was that Catherine Sawyer was the niece of Garrett Sawyer, who had homesteaded a claim directly adjacent to Cornelius's eastern fence line 12 years ago, and had died the previous October of a fever that took him fast and hard. Garrett Sawyer had been a decent neighbor, quiet in his own right, and Cornelius had attended the small funeral service held at the Methodist church without fully processing what it meant for the land. What it meant, as it turned out, was considerable. Garrett Sawyer had died without a will filed in Sumner County, but with a niece in St. Louis who was his nearest living relative, and the law office letter was informing her of her inheritance: 120 acres of Kansas prairie with a small but solid house, a failing well, and debts that amounted to slightly more than what a schoolteacher in Missouri could reasonably pay. This was what Hank Dooley reported, with the breathless enthusiasm of a man who has discovered buried treasure in someone else's yard. Cornelius had stood at his own kitchen window after Hank left and looked out at his eastern fence line for a long time. He thought about what it meant to have that land go to debt collection, to be bought up by the Hargrove Land Company that was already buying up half of Sumner County and running independent ranchers into the ground with their fencing schemes. He thought about what it meant to have that land as a buffer between his own operation and the troubles that came with Hargrove's men, who were not known for their patience or their respect for established property lines. And then, with the particular and tortured logic of a man who genuinely did not know how to do things halfway, he thought about what it would mean for the woman who had inherited it. He did not know Catherine Sawyer. He had a name and a loose set of facts that amounted to schoolteacher, St. Louis niece, inheritor of a problem she had not asked for. That was all. But he sat at his kitchen table that evening, with a kerosene lamp throwing gold across the rough-hewn wood, and he thought about it until the lamp burned low. The next morning he rode to see his lawyer, a man named Douglas Pratt who operated out of a small office on the main street of Caldwell between the hardware store and the land agent. Douglas Pratt had done all of Cornelius's land work for 6 years and was accustomed to his client's particular brand of deliberate decision-making, but even he looked startled when Cornelius explained what he wanted. "You want to transfer the deed on 200 acres of your own land to a woman in St. Louis who you've never met," Douglas said slowly, as if he were translating the words from a foreign language. "Half of what I currently hold," Cornelius corrected. 200 acres on the eastern section, and not as a transfer outright. I want it structured as a joint deed, her name and mine both on it, so she has legal claim and security, but the land isn't split in a way that makes it unworkable." Douglas Pratt took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his vest. "Cornelius, you understand what you're doing here. You've spent 6 years building that operation. You'd be giving a stranger legal interest in half of it. She's not a stranger. She's Garrett Sawyer's kin. And she's about to lose that neighboring property to debt collectors if nobody does something. If Hargrove's company gets that land, they'll fence me out of the water access on the East Creek within 6 months. I've seen them do it to 3 other ranchers already. So this is a business decision," Douglas said. Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "It's the right thing to do," he said finally, which was not exactly an answer to the question but was, Douglas Pratt had learned, the most honest answer Cornelius Keating ever gave about anything. The paperwork took 2 weeks to prepare properly, and Cornelius reviewed every line of it with the careful attention he gave to everything. He specified that the joint deed covered his 200 eastern acres and included the adjacent Sawyer property as a consolidated holding, that Catherine Sawyer would have full legal right to work, sell, or dispose of her portion, but that neither party could sell the joint-held land without the other's agreement, and that the arrangement was not contingent on any personal agreement or relationship between the parties. He signed it the first morning of April, walked to the county clerk's office in Caldwell and filed it. The clerk, a young man named Percy Walsh, stared at the document for a full 30 seconds. "Sir, this woman hasn't even replied to the law office letter yet far as anyone knows. She may not even come." "Then she'll have something worth coming for," Cornelius said, and put his hat back on and walked out. He rode home in the clean spring morning, the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to leaf out in pale gold green, the meadowlarks going wild in the grass, and he told himself he had done a practical thing, a sensible thing. A thing any reasonable man would do when facing the prospect of a hostile land company on his eastern fence line. He did not let himself think too hard about the fact that he had also enclosed, with the official notification letter that Douglas Pratt's office would forward to St. Louis, a single handwritten note that said only, "The land is good and the house is solid and you would be welcome in Caldwell if you chose to come." It was signed with his name and nothing else. No flowery language, no explanation of feeling, just a fact and an invitation which was, he supposed, the best he could manage. Catherine Sawyer read that note in her small rented room in St. Louis on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of April, with the noise of the city coming in through her window and the smell of coal smoke hanging over everything, and she read it 4 times before she set it down. She was 26 years old, and she had been teaching the children of St. Louis's 4th Ward for 3 years, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the children, whom she genuinely loved, and everything to do with the feeling that her life was a room she had somehow ended up in without choosing it. She was not an unhappy woman by nature. She had dark auburn hair that she pinned up each morning with practiced efficiency, green eyes that noticed everything, and a quality of stillness about her that her students mistook for sternness and her colleagues mistook for contentment, and that was actually neither of those things. It was more like waiting, though she could not have told you what she was waiting for. She had barely known her Uncle Garrett. He had come west before she was old enough to remember clearly, and their correspondence had been occasional at best. A letter at Christmas, sometimes a short note in summer. She remembered him as a man who smelled like hay and wore his kindness quietly, the way some people wear old coats. She had grieved him in her private way when the letter came informing her of his death, and she had written back to the law office requesting details, expecting nothing much. She had not expected Kansas. She had not expected any of this. She sat at her small table with the deed document spread before her, and the single handwritten note from Cornelius Keating, set slightly apart from the rest, as if it had its own gravity, and she thought about what it meant that a man she had never met had given her legal claim to half his land before he had ever said a word to her directly. It was the strangest and most startling thing she had ever encountered in a life that had not, until this moment, contained many startling things. She wrote back 3 days later, not to Douglas Pratt's office, to Cornelius Keating directly, at the address listed on the ranch property papers. She wrote, "I do not understand why you have done this. I suspect the answer matters more than the land itself. I intend to come to Caldwell to find out. I will arrive by rail to Wellington and then by stage in the 3rd week of May, if arrangements can be made. I am not a woman who accepts gifts without understanding their nature. Please do not think I am ungrateful. I think perhaps I am the opposite." She signed it Catherine Sawyer, and then she went and gave her notice at the school, which made the headmaster look at her as if she had announced she was emigrating to the moon. Cornelius received her letter on the 10th of May. He read it in the yard, standing in the full afternoon sun, because he had seen the handwriting on the envelope and had not trusted himself to open it in any room of his house where he might have to immediately sit down. He read it twice. He looked out at the east pasture for a while. Then he went inside and sat down anyway, and read it a 3rd time, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific vertigo of realizing that a thing you had done out of practical necessity and stubborn decency might have also been the bravest thing you had ever done. He wrote back the same afternoon. He told her that arrangements were simple, that the Wellington stage ran to Caldwell twice a week, and that he would have the house on the Sawyer property readied for her arrival if she preferred to stay there rather than at the boarding house in town. He wrote that the East Creek ran clear and fast in spring, and that the wildflowers on the upper meadow were something worth seeing. He wrote 3 drafts of a sentence that began with something closer to what he was actually thinking, and crossed them all out, and ended the letter with only the practical facts. It was not, he knew, a letter that said anything of what was building in him. But he was a man who had learned, through long years of living alone in the wide Kansas silence, that there was wisdom in patience, that some things needed the right ground and the right season before they could be said aloud. He just hoped he would find the words before the courage ran out. The stage from Wellington arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of May, and Cornelius was standing on the boardwalk outside Pruitt's post office because that was the closest legitimate reason he could find to be near the stage stop, without appearing to be waiting there specifically for anyone. He recognized her immediately, which surprised him, because he had no description to go on beyond what he had built in his imagination from 2 letters and the ghost of a dead man's family. But there was something in the way she came down the stage steps that was entirely her own, careful and deliberate but not hesitant. The way a person moves when they are absolutely certain of where their feet are going even if the rest of them is not so sure. She was wearing a practical gray traveling dress that was dusty from the road, and her auburn hair had come partially loose from its pins, and she was carrying a large carpet bag in one hand and looking at Caldwell with the expression of a person who has promised themselves they will not flinch, and is keeping that promise through an act of will. Caldwell was not a comforting first impression. Two cowboys were arguing loudly across the street outside the Lone Star Saloon. A hog was wandering freely down the center of the main road, and the wind off the prairie was delivering a generous portion of dust to everything and everyone within reach. Cornelius crossed the street. "Miss Sawyer," he said, and took off his hat. She turned and looked at him, and whatever she had been expecting, he apparently was not entirely it, because something in her expression shifted slightly, recalibrated. "Mr. Keating," she said. There was a pause in which they both seemed to be taking stock of each other with a frankness that the usual social niceties would not have permitted. "You're taller than I expected," she said, "though I'm not sure what I expected." "You're younger than I expected," he said, and then immediately looked like he wished he hadn't because it had come out sounding like something it wasn't meant to be. She smiled, just a small one at the corner of her mouth. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said too quickly, and then steadied himself. "No, ma'am, I only meant I wasn't sure what the letters had conveyed. Can I take that bag?" She handed it over without ceremony, and they walked together to where he had hitched his horse, and the small wagon he had brought. And the whole town of Caldwell watched from behind various windows and doorways, with the collective interest of a community that had been waiting for something interesting to happen for at least a week and a half. He drove her out to the Sawyer property first, because that was the logical thing to do, and because it gave him something practical to focus on. The 3 miles between Caldwell and the ranch land passed in conversation that was careful and exploratory, the kind of talking two people do when they are both intelligent enough to know that the real conversation has not started yet. She asked about the land, about the cattle, about the terms of the deed in plain language. He answered honestly, including the part about Hargrove's Land Company and the East Creek water access, because she had written that she was not a woman who accepted gifts without understanding their nature, and she deserved the truth of the practical matter. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, looking out at the prairie, which was green and gold in the late afternoon light, the grass moving in long rippling waves that looked almost like water. "So you protected your own interests," she said, "and protected mine at the same time without being asked." "Yes," he said. "And you filed the deed before you wrote me a single word," she said. It was not quite an accusation. It was closer to a fact being examined from several angles. "I did," he said. "I thought if I wrote first and asked, it would sound like an offer that required something in return. The deed meant it was done regardless, so you could come or not come, or write back or not write back, and the land protection would already be in place." She turned and looked at him then, directly, the way she had looked at Caldwell when she stepped off the stage, like a woman who had decided not to flinch. "That is either the most practical or the most romantic thing I have ever heard," she said. "I haven't decided which." He did not know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, which was, she would later decide, exactly the right response. The Sawyer house was small but solid, as he had written, a 2-room timber-frame structure with a kitchen lean-to and a porch that faced east. He had had it cleaned and had put fresh wood in the box beside the stove and had left, on the kitchen table, a pot of preserved plum jam that Mrs. Hank Dooley had contributed to the cause with entirely transparent matchmaking enthusiasm, and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth from the bakery in Caldwell. Catherine stood in the doorway and looked at the jam and the bread, and then looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I didn't want to presume," he said, "about the food," gesturing vaguely. "You've already given me half your land," she said. "Jam seems well within the scope of reasonable presumption." He laughed. It came out before he could think about it, a real laugh, and she blinked as if the sound had surprised her too. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said. "My property line is a 1/4 mile west through those cottonwoods. If you need anything, there's a bell on the post at the gate." He paused. "I'll come check tomorrow if that's agreeable." "It's agreeable," she said. And then, as he was turning, "Mr. Keating, thank you for all of it, not just the bread." He nodded, put his hat on, and drove home in the long Kansas twilight, feeling like a man who had been standing in a cold wind for 6 years and had just stepped into somewhere warm. The following weeks were a kind of careful unfolding. Cornelius came by the Sawyer property most mornings on legitimate pretense. The fence along the creek boundary needed checking. The well needed a second opinion. There was a question about the eastern pasture's drainage that required looking at from both sides of the property line. Catherine received him each time with that same quality of clear-eyed attention, and they would walk the land together while he explained things, and she asked questions that were, he noticed, never simple questions. She was not a woman who accepted explanations at face value. She wanted to understand the mechanics of things, the logic beneath the surface, and he found that he liked explaining things to someone who genuinely wanted to know. She, for her part, was doing her own kind of adjusting. St. Louis had been noise and crowds and the comforting predictability of a city that never stopped generating small dramas to observe. This was silence and space, and a sky so enormous it felt almost aggressive in its scale. The first week she woke every morning in the small house with something close to panic at the quiet, at the absolute absence of city sounds, and then lay still in the pre-dawn dark and listened to the prairie instead. The wind in the grass, the distant coyotes, the creak of the house settling in the temperature change between night and day, and gradually, it began to sound less like silence and more like something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet. She borrowed a horse from Cornelius after the first week, a steady bay mare named Clover that he brought over with the matter-of-fact air of someone lending a garden tool, and she began riding the land in the mornings. She had ridden as a girl but not in years, and the first few days she was stiff and awkward, which irritated her tremendously, because she was a woman who preferred to be competent at things. But Clover was patient and the prairie was forgiving of slow progress, and by the end of the second week she was riding with the easy confidence of someone who has rediscovered something their body remembered better than their mind did. It was on one of these morning rides, in the second week of June, that she came across the trouble at the East Creek. Two men she didn't know were unloading posts from a wagon on what was clearly the Keating side of the creek, not the Sawyer side, and one of them had a roll of barbed wire that sent a cold clarity through her the moment she understood what she was looking at. "What are you doing?" she called, pulling Clover to a stop at the creek bank. The taller of the two men looked up with the particular expression of someone who has not expected to be questioned. He had the look of a hired hand, but his boots were too good for a ranch worker, and his manner was too casual about being somewhere he shouldn't be. "Hargrove Land Company, ma'am. This land was acquired last month." "It was not," she said with perfect calm. "This land is filed under a joint deed, Keating and Sawyer, at the Sumner County Clerk's office. I am Catherine Sawyer, and I am telling you that you are standing on land that is not Hargrove's and was never for sale." The man looked at her for a moment, calculating. "You got proof of that?" "I have a deed on file in Caldwell that constitutes proof in any court in Kansas," she said. "And I suggest you speak with your employer's lawyers before you put one more post in the ground, because I will ride to Caldwell this morning and have a complaint filed before noon if you do." She was bluffing slightly on the confidence, but not on the facts, and facts in a clear voice had a power that bluster could not match. The two men exchanged a look, and the taller one pulled the post he'd been about to set back out of the ground. She turned Clover and rode straight to Cornelius's ranch. She found him in the yard, working on a harness, and she told him what she had found in a rapid and precise account that covered all the relevant details and ended with, "I sent them off, but they'll be back with their employer's authority behind them, or they'll try to find a legal angle to challenge the deed." Cornelius had gone very still while she was talking, the way he went still when something required his full attention. He set down the harness. "You told them your name." "I did, and they backed down, for now. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "You handled that well." "I handled it correctly," she said, which was a distinction she clearly thought mattered. "We need to speak to your lawyer today." They rode to Caldwell together that morning, side by side on the main road, and Douglas Pratt spent an hour with them going over the deed language and confirming what Catherine already knew. The joint filing was sound, the land was legally protected, and Hargrove's company had no claim. Douglas sent a letter to Hargrove's legal office in Wichita that afternoon, and the posts disappeared from the creek bank within 2 days. It was after they left Douglas Pratt's office, walking back along the Caldwell boardwalk to where their horses were hitched, that Cornelius stopped outside the small apothecary and said, "Can I buy you coffee? There's a decent enough place next to the hardware store." Looked at him. "That is the first social thing you have suggested," she said. "I know," he said. "Then yes," she said. "I would like that." The coffee was strong and came in heavy ceramic mugs, and they sat across from each other at a small table in the corner of the establishment, which was technically a general merchandise counter with 2 tables shoved to one side for optimistic patrons, and they talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about the land, not about the deed or the lawyers or Hargrove's fencing scheme. They talked about everything else. She told him about the school in St. Louis, about the children she had taught, about the particular grief of having students who came to class hungry, and there being almost nothing she could do about it. He told her about coming to Kansas as a young man of 25 with $200, and a stubbornness that his mother had always said would either save him or finish him. She laughed at that, genuinely, and the sound of it in that small room did something entirely inconvenient to his ability to think coherently. He told her about building the first soddy in the brutal winter of 1872 and the spring flood of 1873 that took out his first planting, and how he had stood in the ruined field and felt briefly that he was beaten, and then had felt something harder come up in him and had gone back to work. She listened with her chin resting in her hand and her green eyes very steady and said, "I think I understand that feeling. That moment when you decide you are not going to lie down." "Yes," he said, "that one exactly. I had it when I read your letter," she said, "and your note about the land. I could have written back and said thank you very much, but I have no interest in Kansas. I could have had the deed handled by the lawyers and sold my portion and been done with it. But something in what you wrote made me think that lying down was not the right answer." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you didn't lie down," he said, which was a simple thing to say, and yet the most direct thing he had managed since she arrived. She met his eyes across the table and did not look away, and the moment lasted a beat longer than conversation strictly required, and then she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and said, "Tell me about the cattle," and they were back on safe ground, except that the ground felt permanently different now, as if it had been quietly shifted 6 inches to the left while they were looking the other way. Summer arrived full and blazing, the Kansas heat pressing down on everything like a heavy hand, the creek running lower as July wore on, the grass going from green to gold to a dry, dusty amber that rustled in the wind like paper. Catherine found her rhythm in it, the practical rhythms of managing a small property. She kept a kitchen garden that she tended with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She learned to manage the well with the bucket and the rope. She became competent enough on Clover to ride to Caldwell and back without thinking much about it. She and Cornelius developed a pattern without quite deciding to. He came by most mornings. Some evenings she walked the 1/4 mile through the cottonwoods to his ranch, where they would sit on the porch in the cooling air and talk, or sometimes not talk, just sit in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them, the kind of quiet that only comes between people who have stopped needing noise to fill the space. Hank Dooley rode by one afternoon in early July to invite them both to the community barn dance at the Patterson farm, and delivered the invitation with the unconvincing casualness of a man executing a scheme. His wife, who was by all accounts the actual architect of the scheme, had apparently decided that if Cornelius Keating and Catherine Sawyer needed assistance in realizing the obvious, she was the woman for the job. "You should come," Cornelius said to Catherine after Hank had ridden off. They were standing at the fence between their properties, which was where they ended up most mornings without quite planning it. "It's a good community thing. You'll meet the Pattersons and the Alvarez family and the Hoffmans. Good people, most of them." "Will there be dancing?" she asked. "There's always dancing," he said, and looked at the fence post. "Do you dance?" she asked. "Not well," he said. She smiled at the fence post too. "Neither do I," she said, "which means we'll match each other." He did not quite smile back, but something happened at the corner of his mouth that amounted to the same thing. The Patterson barn dance was on a Saturday in the second week of July, and half of Sumner County turned out for it in the warm summer dark. Lanterns hung from the barn rafters, throwing yellow light over the fiddle players and the crowd, and the smell of sawdust and hay, and the food tables set up along the side wall, made it feel like something out of a gentler world than the one that usually operated in Caldwell. Catherine wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-green cotton that she had brought from St. Louis, and that was considerably finer than anything else in Caldwell, though she wore it so naturally that it seemed like a statement of character rather than a display of sophistication. She arrived with Cornelius, who had driven her in the wagon and had worn his better shirt and had clearly run a brush through his hair, which she noticed without mentioning. The Dooleys were already there, and Mrs. Dooley, a bright, energetic woman named Pearl, descended on Catherine with the warm imperiousness of someone who has decided you are going to like her and is simply waiting for you to catch up. She introduced Catherine to everyone within arm's reach in rapid succession. The Patterson family, enormously hospitable and built like furniture, the Hoffman couple who had come from Germany a decade ago and still peppered their English with occasional German in moments of strong feeling, and the Alvarez family, whose patriarch, Felipe Alvarez, was a vaquero who had settled his family on 160 acres south of Caldwell and was one of the finest horsemen in the county and one of its better neighbors. Felipe Alvarez shook Catherine's hand with a slight formality and said that he had heard she had faced down Hargrove's fencemen at the creek, and that in his view this demonstrated more sense than most newcomers showed in their first year. This was high praise, Pearl Dooley explained afterward, and Catherine should take it as such. The fiddles started up and the dancing began, and true to their conversation at the fence post, both Cornelius and Catherine were approximately terrible at it. They managed one reel together that was more enthusiasm than technique, laughing at their own missteps in a way that was entirely unguarded, and afterward they stood together at the edge of the dancing with their arms almost touching and watched the more competent dancers with the comfortable companionship of two people who have privately agreed that watching is also fine. "You're laughing more than I expected," she said to him at one point. "You're easier to talk to than I expected," he said. "People usually make me feel like I'm failing at something I didn't know I was supposed to be doing." She looked at him. "I make you feel differently." He looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. The music went on and the night was warm and the stars over Kansas were extravagant and indifferent to human difficulty, as they always had been and always would be, and Catherine Sawyer stood in that barn with her arm barely touching Cornelius Keating's and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the room she was in was one she had chosen. In the third week of July, there was a difficulty. A man named Boyd Calloway, who was one of Hargrove's field agents and who had apparently been nursing a considerable resentment about the Eastern Creek situation, rode to the county clerk's office and filed a challenge claiming that the joint deed was fraudulently registered, the grounds being a technicality about the consolidation of the Sawyer inheritance claim with Keating's existing land. It was not a strong challenge. Douglas Pratt said as much when he summoned Cornelius and Catherine to his office to discuss it. "It won't hold in a proper hearing," Douglas said, spreading papers across his desk. But it will delay things, and while it's delayed, Calloway's going to argue that the east pasture fence isn't legal, which means his people could move back in on the creek and claim they're operating in a disputed zone. How long for a proper hearing? Cornelius asked. Could be 2 months. 3. County judge has a full calendar. What would strengthen our position in the meantime? Catherine asked. Douglas looked at her and then at Cornelius and then back at her, with an expression that was attempting neutrality and not quite achieving it. Technically speaking, a unified household would make the joint deed claim considerably more straightforward to defend. The law's always been more comfortable with clear domestic arrangements than with business partnerships between unmarried parties. There was a silence in the room. You're suggesting we get married, Catherine said. I'm explaining the legal landscape, Douglas said carefully. Another silence. Cornelius was looking at the wall to the left of Douglas's head with extraordinary attention for something that was simply wallpaper. I'll need to think about this, Catherine said. To Douglas, not to Cornelius, which was perhaps a mercy given the state of Cornelius's face at that moment. They walked out of Douglas Pratt's office together and stood on the boardwalk in the July heat, and Cornelius put his hat on and looked at the street. I want you to know, he said without looking at her, that I did not plan that, the deed. I did not file it with any expectation of I want to be clear about that. The deed was what it was meant to be. I didn't do it to maneuver you into anything. I know that, she said. He looked at her then. Do you? Yes, she said. Cornelius. It was the first time she had used his first name, and both of them registered it. I have known for some time that you are not a man who does things with hidden motives. It is one of the more remarkable things about you. He breathed out slowly. Then what do you think, he said, about what Douglas said? She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the street where the same hog from her arrival day, or a convincing relative of it, was wandering contentedly past the front of the general store. I think, she said carefully, that I came to Kansas to find out why a man would give a stranger half his land, and I think I've found out. And I think that matters more than the legal situation, which would only be a reason if there weren't already another one. He turned to look at her fully, and she looked back at him, and neither of them was pretending about what was happening between them now. Catherine, he said, and stopped. Yes, she said. I have not, he said slowly, working through it, been good at saying the things that are happening inside me. I have been better at doing them, which is maybe backward. Maybe, she said, or maybe it's its own kind of language. I should have written to you about more than the land, he said, in those letters. I should have written, he stopped again. He looked at his hat in his hands and then back at her. I should have written that I have thought about you every day since your letter arrived, and that every morning I walk to that fence line with some reason that isn't the real reason, and that sitting on my porch in the evenings doesn't feel like enough because I can see your light through the cottonwoods, and that isn't the same as. He stopped a third time. As what? She asked quietly. As having you there, he said. She was quiet for a moment that felt enormous. The street went on around them, Caldwell going about its loud and dusty business, completely indifferent to the two people standing on a boardwalk having the most important conversation of their lives. Ask me properly, she said. Catherine Sawyer, he said, and his voice was steady in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life. I cannot promise you ease because this land doesn't offer it to anyone. But I can promise you honesty, and that I will spend whatever time I have trying to deserve the fact that you came. Will you marry me? She looked at him for a moment that stretched out like prairie. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep, and she stepped forward and took his hand, and they stood like that in the July heat of Caldwell, Kansas, while the hog wandered on and the street went about its business. And neither of them let go. They married in August, a quiet ceremony at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, attended by Douglas Pratt as witness, the Dooley family who arrived in their best clothes with Pearl Dooley openly weeping from the first moment, the Alvarez family, the Hoffmans, the Pattersons, and the entirety of the Methodist congregation plus several Baptists who had heard about it and came anyway. The minister, Reverend Thomas Haley, who had known Cornelius for 6 years and had privately given up on the prospect of ever marrying him off, delivered the ceremony with a barely contained satisfaction that could be seen from the back pews. Catherine wore a dress of ivory cotton that Pearl Dooley had helped her alter from a pattern sent from St. Louis, and she had flowers from the creek bank meadow in her hair, the small wild ones that grew along the water's edge in late summer, purple and gold. And Cornelius stood at the front of the church in his best suit and looked at her coming down the aisle with an expression that Pearl Dooley would describe for years afterward as the face of a man who has just realized that everything up to this point was the preamble. When the minister asked for vows, Cornelius said his with the particular steadiness that Catherine had come to think of as his truest quality, and when she said hers, she looked at him directly and meant every syllable in a way that felt completely different from ceremony, more like testimony. After, there was a gathering at the Patterson barn that was considerably more festive than the legal situation at the county clerk's office warranted, and the fiddles played, and Catherine and Cornelius danced again, no better than the last time, and cared considerably less. Boyd Calloway's deed challenge collapsed within 6 weeks. Douglas Pratt appeared before the county judge with the marriage certificate, the consolidated deed documentation, the original homestead filings, and a brief so thorough that Calloway's lawyers apparently spent the hearing looking at the ceiling. The judge ruled in favor of Keating Sawyer on all points. Hargrove's land company retreated from the East Creek boundary permanently, partly because of the legal defeat and partly because Felipe Alvarez, who had his own ongoing disputes with Hargrove's operations to the south, organized a meeting of a dozen neighboring ranchers who made it collectively clear that the East Sumner County territory was not going to be as yielding as Hargrove's men had assumed. The summer ended and autumn came, painting the cottonwoods gold along the creek and bringing the first bite of wind off the northern plains. The cattle drives of 1878 wound down along the Chisholm Trail, and Caldwell quieted into its seasonal peace, and Cornelius and Catherine settled into the life they were building together with the unself-conscious thoroughness of two people who have been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this. They lived in Cornelius's ranch house, which was larger and more established, and the Sawyer house became, over time, the place where Catherine kept her books and her writing desk, and the small things she had brought from St. Louis, a few volumes of poetry, a set of watercolor paints she had used since girlhood, a wooden box of letters from friends back east that she answered less and less frequently as the months went on, not because she cared less about the writers, but because the life she was living was increasingly difficult to translate into the language of people who had not seen Kansas. She told Cornelius about the watercolors one evening in October when they were sitting by the fire after supper, and he asked to see them. She showed him a small study she had done of the cottonwoods along the East Creek, tentative and not entirely successful, and he looked at it for a long time. "You've got the light right," he said, "the way it comes through in early morning." "You can see that?" she asked, surprised. "I've been looking at those trees for 6 years," he said. "I'd know the light on them anywhere." He handed it back to her carefully. "You should paint more." "I always feel like it's indulgent," she said, "like I should be doing something useful instead." He looked at her with the particular straightforward quality of his gaze that still, even now, occasionally landed on her with the force of something more physical. "Seeing things clearly is useful," he said. "You're good at it. The painting is just how you keep a record of it." She looked at the small watercolor and then at him. "You say things like that," she said. "Like what?" "Things that are exactly right, in a way that doesn't seem like you planned them." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had a lot of time alone to think," he said, "and not many people to say things to. I think it just made me careful about what I said when there was someone to say it to." She set down the watercolor and leaned toward him, and he met her halfway, and the fire crackled in the grate, and the wind moved across the Kansas dark outside the window, and neither of them thought about anything beyond the particular and specific warmth of that room. That winter was harsh, as Kansas winters could be, with blizzards that moved across the plains with a speed and violence that always startled newcomers and seasoned residents alike. The cattle needed constant managing, the water sources needed watching for ice, and the physical work of keeping a ranch alive in a blizzard was all-consuming and occasionally terrifying. There was one night in December when a storm came in so fast that Cornelius had to fight his way to the barn through a near whiteout to secure the animals, and Catherine lit every lamp in the house and stood at the window watching for his return with her heart doing something that was not entirely calm. He came back covered in snow, ice in his eyebrows, hands red and stiff, and she had warm water and dry clothes ready before he was fully through the door, and when she pressed the warm cloth to his hands, he looked up at her in the lamplight and said, "I'm all right," which was not quite what either of them was talking about. "I know," she said. "I just needed you back inside." He turned his hands and held hers, and they sat like that in the kitchen while the storm screamed outside, and it was in that moment, in the middle of a Kansas blizzard with the house shuddering in the wind, that Catherine thought, "This is it. This is what I came for. Not the land. Not the legal protection or the practical arrangements or even the adventure of a new life. This specific warmth between two specific people in the middle of a specific storm." She told him this later, after the storm had passed and they were lying in the dark listening to the quiet that came after blizzards, that particular profound silence that was the prairie's way of exhaling. "I didn't know it at first," she said. "When I came, I thought I was coming to understand a practical thing. Why you filed the deed, what kind of man does something like that?" "And," he said, "and I found out what kind of man," she said, "the kind who does the right thing before he knows whether it will matter. The kind who gives without calculating. I had never met anyone like that." He was quiet for a while. Outside, the snow had settled into silence. "I had been alone for a long time," he said finally. "I told myself I was content, and I was in the way a person is content when they don't know what they're missing." "And now?" she asked. He pulled her closer in the dark. "Now I know what I was missing," he said, "and I don't know how I managed 6 years without it." Spring came again, as it always does to Kansas, with the grass coming back green and urgent, and the meadowlarks returning, and the whole land shaking itself back to life, with an exuberance that felt, every year, like a small miracle. The East Creek ran high with snowmelt, and the wildflowers in the upper meadow were even more extravagant than Cornelius had promised in his first letter, which Catherine reminded him of one April morning while they were riding the property line together. "You said they were something worth seeing," she said, looking out at the swaths of purple and gold across the upper meadow. "I said it," he agreed. "You were right," she said. "You were right about most of it." "Most," he said. "Well, you didn't warn me about the winter," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "Would it have changed anything?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to any real question. "No," she said finally. "It wouldn't have." It was in the early spring of 1879 that Catherine told Cornelius she was expecting their first child. She told him over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with her characteristic directness, and he went very still in the way he did when something had hit him at the center, and then he stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands with a tenderness that was almost ceremonial. "Are you well?" he said first, which was so entirely him that she loved him with a force that was almost painful. "I am well," she said. "I am very well." Kissed her forehead, then her hair, and then sat back down and looked at his coffee cup as if it contained the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "I didn't dare hope for this," he said quietly. "Why not?" she asked. "Because I'd already gotten more than I had any right to expect," he said. Hoping for more seemed like tempting something. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Cornelius Keating," she said, "you are allowed to want things. You are allowed to hope for them. You did not get me by some cosmic accident. You got me because you acted with your whole heart before you had any reason to think it would be answered." Don't be afraid to keep doing that." He turned his hand under hers and held on. "I'm going to try," he said. Their son was born in October of 1879, in the bedroom of the ranch house with the midwife from Caldwell, a formidable woman named Mrs. Beatrice Corley, who ran the entire affair with military efficiency and declared afterward that it had been a textbook case, which was high praise from a woman not given to any kind of excess. Pearl Dooley was there as well, and wept with her characteristic enthusiasm, and Hank Dooley waited outside and paced a trench in the porch boards. Cornelius waited in the kitchen with a kind of controlled panic that he managed through the simple expedient of making coffee, drinking it, making more coffee, and staring at the wall. When Mrs. Corley came out and told him he had a healthy son and a wife who was doing beautifully, he had to sit down. He went in when she called him, and Catherine was propped against the pillows with her hair loose around her shoulders and the baby in her arms, and she looked up at him with tired and luminous eyes and said, "Come and meet him." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at his son, who was red-faced and aggressively present and entirely unwilling to stop announcing himself to the world. Something in Cornelius's chest rearranged itself permanently. "He's loud," he said. "He's healthy," Catherine said. "What do we call him?" he said. She had thought about this. "Garrett," she said. "For my uncle." He looked at her. Garrett. The man who had begun all of this, unknowingly, by homesteading a piece of Kansas prairie 12 years ago and leaving it to a niece in St. Louis. The man whose land had become the pivot point around which everything else had turned. "Garrett James Keating," Cornelius said, trying it out. James had been his own father's name. "Garrett James Keating," she agreed, and leaned her head against his shoulder while the baby continued his loud and emphatic insistence on being noticed. Outside, Pearl Dooley cried with renewed energy. Hank Dooley stopped pacing and sat down heavily on the porch step and looked out at the Kansas dark with the expression of a man who has been unexpectedly moved by something and is not sure how to account for it. Garrett James Keating grew into a brown-eyed, determined child who inherited his father's physical steadiness and his mother's instinct for asking the question beneath the question. He was walking before 10 months, which Mrs. Corley declared was early even by the standards of farm children, and talking in full sentences well before 2, which his mother declared was a matter of environment since she had been talking to him as if he were a full conversational participant since the day he was born. The ranch grew alongside him. Cornelius expanded the cattle operation, buying a small additional herd in 1880 and hiring 2 permanent ranch hands, brothers named Sam and William Foss from Texas, who were competent workers and who treated Catherine with the particular combination of respect and slight wariness that men of the era reserved for women who were clearly not to be condescended to. Catherine managed the household accounts and the correspondence with the buyers who came up the trail, and she did it with the organizational rigor of a woman who had once had 30 children's educational records in her head simultaneously, which is to say she did it without a hint of difficulty. She also finished teaching herself the land, every acre of it, in a way that eventually made her as familiar with the property as Cornelius himself. She knew where the East Creek ran shallow enough to ford after a dry summer, where the drainage was poor in spring, which sections of the upper meadow produced the best grass and which the cattle avoided. She had the practical knowledge that comes from being attentive over time, from treating the land as something to be understood rather than merely used, and this was something she and Cornelius shared, this quality of sustained attention to the world around them. In the evenings, after Garrett was in bed, they sat on the porch in summer and by the fire in winter, and they talked. They never seemed to run out of things to talk about, which continued to surprise both of them mildly, because they were each, independently, people who had spent large portions of their lives being essentially quiet. But together they were different. Together they filled the space with something that felt necessary. He had learned to say things by then. The words that had been so difficult in the beginning had loosened over time, like a door in a new frame that finally settles into its opening. He told her he loved her in the ordinary way, in the middle of ordinary moments, the kind of telling that is not declaration but simply description. I love you, the way you say that. I love you, watching you with him. I love you, sitting here in the dark with you. She received these offerings with the full attention she gave to everything, and gave them back in kind. And between them it became a kind of running conversation that neither of them felt the need to perform or make formal, just a continuous thread of acknowledgement that the other person was the specific person they wanted to be near. In the spring of 1881, the matter of the school came up. There was a school in Caldwell, a single-room building on the north end of town that had been managed by a succession of teachers, most of them young men who stayed a year or two and moved on. The current teacher, a pleasant but underprepared young man named Mr. Abernathy, had announced his intention to marry a girl back in Ohio and return east before the next school year. The school board, which consisted of 3 Caldwell businessmen and Reverend Haley, sent a delegation to the Keating ranch on a Wednesday afternoon that was transparently aimed at Catherine. She listened to their proposal with that expression of careful attention that newcomers sometimes mistook for approval, and that was actually just her way of taking full stock of a situation before responding. I taught 40 children at once in St. Louis, she said. How many children are we talking about here? 17 currently enrolled, said the board chairman, a hardware merchant named Calvin Briggs. Could be more if families knew there was a reliable teacher. What is the salary? She asked. The salary was $30 a month, which was standard for the era and the location, and was not lavish but was not insulting. She asked about the condition of the building, the availability of books and supplies, and whether the board would commit to ordering specific additional materials she considered essential. She discussed it with Cornelius that evening, not asking permission, but genuinely talking it through in the way they did with anything that affected the shape of their shared life. Do you want to do it? He asked. I think I've been wanting to do it since I arrived, she said. I've been watching those children in Caldwell and thinking about what they need. Then do it, he said. It will change the daily arrangements, she said. Garrett will need to come with me on school days until he's older, or we'll need to arrange. Catherine, he said. Do you want to do it? She met his eyes. Yes. Then the rest is logistics, he said. We'll figure out the logistics. She took the position for the 1881 school year and went at it with all the focused energy of someone who has found the intersection of what they know and what they care about. The school board, which had been primarily hoping to get a warm body in the schoolroom, discovered within the first month that they had gotten considerably more than that, as Catherine reorganized the curriculum, sent a detailed supply request to a publisher in Kansas City, instituted a reading program that sent books home with children on the weekends, and started a separate evening session twice a week for adults who had never had schooling and wanted it. Cornelius came to the evening sessions twice. The second time, when she looked up from the front of the room and saw him sitting in the back row with a slate tablet like everyone else, she stopped in the middle of a sentence about long division. What are you doing? She asked. Learning long division, he said, with absolute seriousness. I do most of it in my head, but I've never had the formal method explained properly. The adult students found this deeply amusing. Catherine looked at him for a moment with an expression that she attempted to keep professional and failed at entirely, and then continued the lesson. Afterward, driving home under the November stars, she said, You know long division perfectly well. I wanted to see you teach, he said. She was quiet, and she said, You're extraordinary at it, he said. You talk to them like they're capable of anything. Every one of them in that room was leaning forward. She looked out at the road. Don't make me cry on the drive home, she said. Just telling the truth, he said. I know, she said. That's why. In the winter of 1881 and into 1882, the Keating Ranch faced what would later be called the most difficult season in the ranch's history. A drought that had been building through the dry autumn turned the East Creek to a trickle by December, and the cattle had to be managed onto the water sources in the western pasture with a rotating schedule that required constant attention. Then in January, a cold snap came that was brutal even by Kansas standards, and 2 members of the herd were lost. Sam Foss suffered a broken wrist from a fall on the ice. The well at the ranch house needed significant repair. Through all of it, they managed. Not easily, not without cost, but together, and without the kind of panic that erodes a thing at its foundations. Catherine took over some of Sam's responsibilities while he healed, which startled him considerably and impressed him in a way he was not accustomed to articulating. Cornelius worked from before dawn to past dark with a methodical focus that never tipped into despair, and Catherine watched this and understood it as one of the fundamental things about him. He did not waste energy on what couldn't be changed. He put it entirely into what could. At night, when the work was done and the house was quiet and Garrett was sleeping, she would sometimes find Cornelius at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open, calculating and recalculating, and she would sit with him and they would go through the numbers together without any performance of reassurance, just the plain company of 2 people facing the same difficulty from the same side. "We'll be all right," she said one January night, looking at the figures. "Yes," he said. "Not just financially," she said. He looked up. "I mean us," she said. "All of this. We will be all right in the way that matters most." He reached across the ledger and put his hand on her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, and looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said quietly. "I know we will." Spring came slowly in 1882, reluctantly, but it came as it always did. The creek crept back up by April. The grass returned. The herd that had come through the winter intact began to recover weight, and the spring calves arrived in their loud and clumsy abundance, and the whole enterprise of the ranch wound back up like a clock given a new winding. Catherine finished her 2nd year of teaching in June of 1882 with 17 students at the start and 23 at the end, because 3 families that had been keeping their children home for distance or necessity had, by some combination of word of mouth and Catherine's direct personal visits to their farms, enrolled their children mid-year. The school board gave her a formal commendation, which Calvin Briggs delivered with the slightly stunned air of a man who has found himself more impressed than he had intended to be. Garrett was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, which his parents found simultaneously exhausting and delightful. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's gray eyes, and his own particular way of standing with his feet planted that made him look, at 2 years old, like he was preparing to argue a legal point. In the summer of 1882, a family arrived in Caldwell that would matter to all of them. The Ray's family, from South Texas, a couple named Eduardo and Mariana with 3 children, and a story that was not unusual in the West of that era, but was no less painful for being common. They had been farming land in Texas that was legally theirs under the terms of the old land grants, land that had been in Mariana's family for 2 generations, and they had been driven off it by a combination of Anglo-American legal pressure and outright intimidation that was one of the cruder expressions of the injustice that ran through the land dealings of the era like a fault line. Eduardo Reyes arrived in Caldwell with skills as a stockman and carpenter and very little else, and he worked for a week as a day laborer before Felipe Alvarez, hearing of his situation, vouched for him to Cornelius, who hired him as a 3rd ranch hand. Mariana Reyes spoke limited English, but communicated with a directness that Catherine recognized as a quality she respected regardless of language. And by September, Mariana had enrolled all 3 children in the school, and Catherine had begun spending her lunch hours teaching Mariana English with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. The injustice of what had happened to the Reyes family was something Catherine and Cornelius discussed at length. It was not an unfamiliar story in Kansas or Texas or anywhere else in the West, where the rights of Mexican families under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were routinely ignored or circumvented by a legal system that was structurally biased against them. Eduardo Reyes was a man who had lost his family's land through the same kind of legal manipulation that Hargrove had attempted with the East Creek boundary, except that for the Reyes family there had been no Douglas Pratt to file a counterbrief and no joint deed to protect their claim. "What happened to them could have happened to us," Catherine said one evening. "If you hadn't acted when you did, if I hadn't come." "It happens to people who have no one acting on their side," Cornelius said. "That's the machinery of it. We should be on their side," she said, "in whatever way we can be." They were, in whatever ways were available. Cornelius paid Eduardo Reyes fairly and gave him consistent work and a reference that eventually helped him establish his own modest land claim in 1884. Catherine taught Mariana and the children with the same quality of attentive investment she gave to every student, and the Reyes family became part of the community of people around the Keating Ranch in a way that was genuine rather than charitable, because Eduardo and Mariana were people worth knowing, and eventually the Keating children would know the Reyes children as their nearest friends. The autumn of 1882 brought another change, and this one Catherine announced again at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, which Cornelius had privately decided was her chosen vehicle for important news, and which he had come to regard with a mixture of affection and mild apprehension. "Another one," he said when she told him. "Another one," she confirmed. He set down his coffee, stood up, came around the table, and held her face in his hands exactly as he had the first time. She had been watching for this. She was, in fact, entirely certain he would do it, and when he did she closed her eyes for a moment. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. Their second child, a daughter, was born in June of 1883, on a warm summer morning with the whole prairie bright outside the window and the meadowlarks absolutely insistent. They named her Eleanor, which had been Cornelius's mother's name, and which he had never asked Catherine to use but which she offered without prompting, which was one of the ways she told him things she didn't always put into words. Eleanor Ruth Keating arrived in the world with less noise than her brother, but with a quality of attentiveness that was notable from the first days. She watched everything with enormous dark eyes, which she had from her mother's side of the family, and had a stillness about her that would later make people think she was calculating things, which she was. Garrett received his sister with 3-year-old seriousness. He examined her for several minutes and then announced that she was very small and asked when she would be big enough to ride a horse, which Mrs. Corley thought was charming, and which Catherine gently explained might be a few years off. The family grew, and the ranch grew alongside it. The years of the mid-1880s were good ones for the Keating operation. The cattle herd expanded, the land was well managed, and Cornelius's reputation for fair dealing made him a respected figure in the county, not the loudest voice in Caldwell, but the one that people listened to most carefully when he did speak. Catherine continued teaching, taking a year off with each child and then returning, and the school continued to grow in enrollment and scope. In 1885, the school board voted to hire a second teacher for the primary grades, which was a direct result of the enrollment growth that Catherine's tenure had generated, and the decision to hire a young woman named Miss Clara Weston, who had just come from a teacher's college in Lawrence, was one that Catherine advocated for strongly, and that Miss Weston always credited as the beginning of her career. In the summer of 1885, Cornelius did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He wrote a letter to the Caldwell Gazette, which was the county newspaper, about the situation of the Reyes family and others like them. A plain, factual, and devastating account of how the legal mechanisms of land acquisition were being used to dispossess families of Mexican and indigenous heritage from land that was legally and historically theirs. He wrote it with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, without passion in the surface language, but with a moral clarity underneath it that made it impossible to dismiss. The letter caused a considerable stir in Sumner County and was reprinted in a Wichita paper, and generated both a supportive response from some quarters and an angry response from others, some of which arrived at the ranch in the form of hostile letters that Catherine read and filed and did not show Cornelius until he specifically asked about them. "You knew about these," he said. "I didn't want them to discourage you from writing more," she said. He looked at her. "They wouldn't have." "I know," she said. "But I also know that you feel things more than you show, and I saw how much you cared about getting that letter right. I thought the angry responses could wait a week." He was quiet for a moment. "You protect me," he said. "You do it so naturally I often don't notice." "You do the same for me," she said, "in your way." He picked up the stack of hostile letters and read through them methodically and then put them back down. "I'll write another one next month," he said. She smiled. "I know you will," she said. The latter years of the 1880s brought Caldwell the changes that were coming to all the Kansas cow towns, as the cattle drives declined, and the railroad expanded, and the nature of Western life shifted beneath everyone's feet. The Chisholm Trail quieted, the wild edge of Caldwell smoothed itself out. Families settled and businesses established themselves with a permanence that felt different from the provisional quality of the early years. Cornelius and Catherine were part of that permanence. The Keating Ranch was one of the established facts of East Sumner County by 1887, known for fair dealing with hands and buyers alike, for the quality of its cattle, and for the particular quality of its owners, who were individually formidable and together something more than the sum of their parts. Garrett Keating grew into a boy who loved the land with an instinctive ease, and who could sit a horse by the time he was 5, and was reading at a level that made Catherine's professional pride compete with her maternal delight, in ways she found pleasantly complicated. Eleanor grew into a child who said less, and observed more, and who had her father's quality of doing the right thing quietly and without ceremony, which Cornelius found in her both endearing and faintly humbling. In 1888, Catherine's old friend from St. Louis, a woman named Helen Marsh, came to visit with her husband for 2 weeks in August, and the visit was revelatory in the way that encounters with the past often are. Helen, who was a warm and intelligent woman, spent the 2 weeks looking at Catherine's life with the interested attention of someone who is trying to understand a world they have not experienced, and on the last evening of the visit, sitting on the Keating porch in the warm August dark, she said to Catherine, "You are happier than anyone I have ever known who has moved this far from everything they started with." "I didn't know I was that unhappy before," Catherine said. "You weren't unhappy," Helen said. "You were incomplete. There's a difference." Catherine thought about this after Helen and her husband left. She was standing in the kitchen the morning after their departure, the house quiet with its usual morning quiet, Cornelius already out in the yard, the children still asleep, and she thought about incomplete and about the particular quality of the completeness she now inhabited. She went out into the yard. Cornelius was at the fence by the barn looking out at the east pasture, and she walked to where he was and stood beside him. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "The east meadow," he said. "Thinking about moving the herd over there next week. The grass is better than it was at the start of summer." She leaned against the fence beside him and looked at the east meadow, green and gold in the morning light, the cottonwoods dark along the creek in the middle distance, the sky above impossibly wide. She thought about the first time she had ridden over this land, tentative and uncertain on borrowed clover, trying to understand what she had come to. She thought about the letter and the deed and the single note about the land being good and the welcome being real. "Cornelius," she said. "Yes." He said, still looking at the meadow. "You gave me half this land before you wrote me a single word of love," she said. He looked at her then. It was the first time she had put it into those exact words, though they had both lived inside the fact of it for a decade. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "About what it means, about what kind of person does that." "We've talked about it before," he said. "Not exactly like this," she said. "I want to say it clearly. The deed was your language before you had words for it." You did the thing that was generous and right and protective, and you did it without knowing if it would ever mean anything to anyone but me, and it became everything." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was feeling something fully and not yet ready to speak it. "I did not know it was love," he said finally. "When I filed the deed, I knew it was the right thing. I knew something happened when I read your letter, but I didn't have a name for it yet." "No," she said, "but you acted on it anyway." "Yes," he said. "That is who you are," she said. "You act before you have the language, and then the language comes." He turned from the meadow and faced her fully, the morning light on both of them. The whole of their shared life spread out in every direction from this point like the Kansas land itself. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you, I think, from the moment your letter told me you were coming because you needed to understand why. Because that was the moment I realized you were someone who understood things the way I try to understand them, from the ground up." She put her hand against his chest, over the steady, reliable beat of his heart. "I love you," she said. "I loved you before I knew you, which sounds impossible, but the deed made you knowable before we met. Do you understand? I knew what kind of man you were before I ever saw your face." He put his hand over hers, holding it there against his chest, and they stood at the fence while the east meadow glowed in the morning light, and the cottonwoods rustled along the creek, and the whole living enterprise of their life together went quietly about its work around them. The years turned, and the life they had built continued to fill in and deepen, the way all good things do when they are tended with patience and care. Garrett Keating at 10 was a serious and capable boy who followed his father around the ranch with the focused interest of someone taking notes, which he sometimes literally was, since his mother had given him a small journal and told him to write down what he learned each day. Alina at 7 was already his mother's most attentive student, reading everything she could reach and asking questions that occasionally required Catherine to think before answering. The Keating ranch hired 2 more hands as the herd grew. Eduardo Reyes had established his own small claim by 1884 and was doing well, and his eldest son, Tomas, worked on the Keating property on weekends and in summers. Felipe Alvarez's daughter Rosa and Garrett Keating were the kind of childhood friends who got into coordinated trouble across both properties, to the resigned amusement of their respective parents. In the spring of 1890, Catherine discovered she was expecting again, and told Cornelius on a Tuesday morning, which she had by now entirely formalized as her standard method of delivery on important news. He went through his established protocol, set down his coffee, came around the table, held her face in his hands. "You always do exactly that," she said. "It is the only correct response," he said. "Are you going to ask if I'm well? Are you well?" "I am very well," she said, as she always said and meant it. Their third child, a second son, was born in November of 1890, dark-haired and loud-opinioned and immediately popular with his older siblings. They named him James, for Cornelius's father, and he grew up with the particular confidence of a child who has always known exactly where he belongs. That winter, in the long evenings by the fire, Cornelius did a thing he had been considering for months. He went to his desk and took out paper and a good pen and sat down to write. Not a letter, not a legal document, something he had never attempted before. He worked on it for several evenings, writing and crossing out and writing again, with the same painstaking care he brought to every important thing. When he finally decided it was right, he folded it and left it on Catherine's watercolor table in the Sawyer house, which had become her studio over the years, where she went when she wanted to paint or write or simply be alone in the particular quality of her own solitude. She found it the following morning, a cold December morning with frost on the windows, and stood in her coat in the small room and read it. It was not long. He was not a man who was long when he could be precise, but it was everything. He had written about the morning he rode to the county clerk's office and why, and about the letter that arrived and the specific quality of the vertigo he had felt, and about watching her come down from the stage in Caldwell with her hair falling loose from its pins and her chin set against the wind. He had written about the barn dance and the coffee, and the moment on the Caldwell boardwalk when she had said, "Ask me properly." He had written about every winter and every spring and every morning at the east fence line and every evening on the porch. And he had written it all in the plain, honest language that was his native tongue. And at the end he had written, "I gave you the land before I found the words because I have always been a man who acts before he speaks. But I want you to have the words now. I have loved every ordinary morning of this life with you. I will love everyone that is still to come. I started with the deed because it was what I had. Everything after was the conversation I had been waiting my whole life to be having." She stood in the cold room and read it twice and then went to find him. He was in the yard and he saw her coming from a distance, across the December frost, moving quickly. He waited. She walked straight to him and put both arms around him and held on without saying anything for a long moment, and he held her in the cold morning, his chin on top of her head. "Well," he said. "You wrote it," she said against his coat. "I did," he said. "It only took you 12 years, she said. He laughed. That real laugh that had first surprised her in a lawyer's office in Caldwell and had never stopped being one of the things she loved best. "I wanted to get it right," he said. She pulled back and looked at him, her cold, brightened face and her green eyes that still, after all this time, saw everything clearly. "You got it right," she said. "You always get things right eventually. That is your particular and infuriating gift." "It doesn't infuriate you," he said. "No," she said. "It never has." They stood together in the December yard of the ranch they had built and protected and worked and loved, the east meadow white with frost and the cottonwoods bare along the creek, and the house behind them with smoke coming from the chimney, and all three children inside making the particular noise that children make on cold mornings when the day is entirely before them. The years that followed were full and ordinary in the way that happy lives are ordinary, which is to say they were not ordinary at all, but rather made of the specific and unrepeatable texture of a life, lived well and together. Garrett grew into a young man who combined his father's physical capability with his mother's intellectual rigor in a way that made him formidable on horseback and excellent in an argument, both of which proved useful on a working ranch in Kansas. Eleanor, who turned 12 in 1895, had her mother's watercolors and her father's patience, and she was already painting the land around their ranch with a skilled and attentive eye. James, the youngest, was 7 in 1897, and had decided that his primary purpose on earth was to be wherever the most interesting thing was happening, which on a cattle ranch was frequently somewhere that required parental retrieval. Catherine taught at the Caldwell School until 1895, when Miss Clara Weston, who had been teaching primary grades since 1885, became the full teacher, and Catherine stepped back from the formal position. She did not step back from the work. She started a lending library from her own collection of books, adding to it over the years through purchases and donations. And by 1898, the Keating Lending Library was a small but genuine institution in East Sumner County, with 3 wooden shelves in the old Sawyer house and a sign outside that said books available to all and was meant exactly as it said. Cornelius continued to write to the Caldwell Gazette and occasionally to the Wichita papers on matters of land rights and the treatment of communities whose legal standing in the territory was routinely ignored or undermined. He was never a man who made speeches or sought office or built himself a public persona, but the letters kept coming, plainly written and morally clear, and over the years they contributed to a small but real current of opinion in Sumner County that took seriously the rights of everyone who worked the land. In the summer of 1897, on a warm July evening that smelled like grass and creek water and the wood smoke from the outdoor fire where they had cooked supper, Cornelius and Catherine sat on the porch together as they had sat on porches in the first summer of their marriage and every summer since. The children were nearby. Garrett at 17 working on something at the barn, Eleanor at 14 somewhere in the upper meadow with her watercolors, James at 7 running a complicated and loud game with Tomas Reyes's younger cousins along the creek bank. The sun went down over the Kansas prairie in one of those extravagant summer sunsets that made the whole sky look like it was on fire, gold and rose and deep burning amber. And the meadowlarks were going at it in the grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek were dark silhouettes against the brilliant sky. Catherine put her hand on Cornelius's arm, and he covered it with his own hand without looking away from the sunset, and they sat together in the warm evening while the land they had built their life on went gold and then purple around them. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if you hadn't filed the deed?" He thought about it seriously, because she asked serious questions and deserved serious answers. "Hargrove's men would have moved on the creek boundary within a season," he said. "The ranch would have been in trouble by 1879. I might have lost the eastern pasture." "That's the practical answer," she said. "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment. The sky was going from amber to deep rose. "If I hadn't filed the deed, you wouldn't have come, or you would have come for different reasons and found different things. The rest of it wouldn't have happened." "No," she said. "I can't think about that," he said. "The version of things where you didn't come, I've tried occasionally and I can't construct it. My mind won't hold it." "Mine either," she said. "When I filed that deed," he said slowly, "I thought I was doing one thing, protecting the land, making a practical decision. But I think some part of me knew it was more than that, and that part is why I added the note, why I told you you'd be welcome." A practical man doesn't add a note about welcome. A practical man sends the legal document and leaves it at that. "No," she said, "he doesn't. I wanted you to come," he said. "I just didn't know yet that that was what I wanted. My hands knew before my head did, which is very backward." "No," she said, "that is exactly the right order. That is how the best things start, not with the thought, with the act." He looked at her then, in the fading light, her profile against the blazing sky, her auburn hair more copper now than red after these years of Kansas sun, her face so deeply familiar and still so capable of making something catch in his chest. 21 years she had been in his life since the first letter arrived in St. Louis, 19 years since she had stepped off the stage in Caldwell, 19 years since they had stood on a boardwalk and she had told him to ask her properly. "I would do it again," he said. "The deed, every version of it. Any world where there's a letter and a woman and a piece of land that needs protecting, I would do the same thing." She turned to look at him. "Because of the land," she said, with the smallest trace of a smile. "No," he said, "because the land was only ever an excuse for the better thing. The land was the door. You were what was on the other side of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the last of the Kansas sunset burn itself out over the prairie. And around them, the sounds of their life continued. The distant voice of James being called in from the creek of the barn door as Garrett finished his work, Alina's footsteps on the grass as she came back from the meadow with her paint box, the meadowlarks making their last claims on the evening. The following spring, when the wildflowers came back to the upper meadow in their extravagant annual insistence, Catherine went out one morning with her watercolors and painted the whole sweep of it, the prairie in full bloom with the cottonwoods along the creek and the pale blue of the enormous Kansas sky above everything. She worked at it for several mornings, returning each time to the same spot, adding to it, and refining it with the patient attention she had always given to the things she cared about most. When it was done, she brought it into the house and hung it in the main room, above the fireplace, where the light from the window fell across it well. Cornelius stood and looked at it for a long time. "That's ours," he said. "Yes," she said. "All of it," he said. "The meadow, the creek, the sky. All of it," she said. He looked at it a while longer and then at her, and then he said something that was perhaps the fullest and truest thing he had ever said, which given the competition was no small distinction. "When I was young," he said, "before Kansas, I used to wonder what it was that made a piece of land into a home. I thought it was time. That you worked it long enough and something clicked into place, but it's not time." "No," she said, waiting. "It's who you share it with," he said. "The land is the same land." The The sky is the same sky, but everything I look at here I look at because of you. Every morning I see those cottonwoods and think about the first time you rode to them. Every time it floods I think about the night in the blizzard when you had warm water ready. Every good year and every hard year, you're in all of them. You made it a home, not the deed, not the work, you. She crossed the room and stood beside him, both of them looking at the painting of their land, the sweep of wildflowers across the upper meadow, the dark line of cottonwoods, the great high sky. We made it a home, she said. Together, that's the whole of the story. And it was. The whole of it, from a deed filed before a word of love was spoken, to a life built on the good Kansas ground that neither of them had come by easily, and both of them had earned in every way that mattered. The land was real, and the life on it was real, and the love between them was the most real thing of all. Not the sudden variety that blazes up and burns itself out, but the deep-rooted kind that has survived winters and droughts and legal challenges, and the long, ordinary work of being two people trying to do right by each other and by the world around them. Outside the window the east meadow bloomed, and the creek ran clear in the spring light, and the cottonwoods rustled with something that might have been approval, and Cornelius Keating stood with his wife in the house they had built together and felt, as he did every day, the specific and irreplaceable rightness of having found, in the strangest possible way, the person he was meant to stand beside. He had written the deed first. The love had come second, and then it had come with everything, and it had not stopped coming since. And in the years that followed, as Garrett grew into the kind of man who ran the east pasture with his father's steady hand and his mother's clear eye, and Aliner's paintings began to travel beyond Sumner County to places that surprised everyone and surprised Aliner least of all, and James grew into a boy, and then a young man with a laugh that filled rooms, and a habit of knowing exactly where he was needed, the Keating Ranch went on being what it had always been. A piece of good Kansas ground where two people had chosen each other before they fully knew what they were choosing, and had spent the rest of their lives discovering that they had chosen right. The land endured. The creek ran on. The wildflowers came back every spring without being asked, which is what wildflowers do, and which is also, if you think about it, what love does when it has found the right ground to grow in. Catherine Sawyer Keating painted that meadow every spring for the rest of her life, never quite the same twice, always recognizably itself. Cornelius Keating sat on the porch and watched her paint and thought, every time, that he was the luckiest man in Sumner County, which was almost certainly true, and probably a significant understatement. The deed was framed eventually in 1905 and hung in Douglas Pratt's office for years after both Cornelius and Douglas were gone, because Douglas had a fondness for it that he never quite adequately explained, but that had something to do with the fact that it was the most extraordinary document he had ever filed, and the most human one, and the one he always thought of when someone asked him whether the law was capable of serving love as well as it served property. It was, he always said. On the best days it was. And the land went on and the family went on, and the love that had started with a deed and a note about welcome, and a woman who came because she needed to understand why went on too, rooted deep in the Kansas earth, flowering every spring in the meadow above the East Creek, permanent as anything ever is on the wide and changeable and magnificent prairie, which is to say, permanent enough and more than enough, and exactly what it was always meant to be.